Imagine a world where the ordinary rules of life did not apply, a world filled with challenges, corruption, and the struggle between right and wrong. In the midst of this world, there lived a man whose life was unlike any other in history. His name was Enoch, and he was the seventh generation from Adam. From the moment he took his first breath, it was clear that his life would be extraordinary. Unlike those around him, Enoch walked closely with God every day, cultivating a relationship so deep that it would change the course of history and leave a lasting legacy for generations to come. Enoch's story begins in a lineage that was carefully chosen to uphold faith amid growing darkness. Humanity had strayed far from its Creator. Violence, pride, and selfishness were rampant, yet Enoch's ancestors had preserved a flame of devotion, passing down knowledge of God, stories of creation, and lessons of righteousness, from Adam to Seth, from Seth to Enoch, and down the line to Jared. Each generation carried wisdom, faith, and a commitment to living in harmony with the divine. It was into this heritage that Enoch was born, a man destined not only to live differently, but to embody the possibility of walking in perfect fellowship with God. As a child, Enoch was surrounded by teachings of faith and practical wisdom. His family nurtured his mind, spirit, and heart, guiding him in understanding the eternal principles that governed life. From daily prayers to lessons about worship and moral responsibility, Enoch was trained to see beyond the fleeting concerns of the world around him. He observed the contrast between his godly lineage and a society consumed by ambition and violence, learning early on that true fulfillment comes not from wealth or power, but from devotion, integrity, and love for God. What made Enoch truly remarkable was not simply his adherence to tradition, but his personal connection with God. Walking with God was not a metaphor for him, it was a lived experience, a daily practice of communion that shaped his decisions, thoughts, and character. People around him noticed the difference. Even in a world filled with skepticism and indifference, Enoch's life shone as an example of hope, faith, and unwavering dedication. Over time, this extraordinary relationship prepared Enoch for the ultimate distinction. He would not experience death as others do. God, recognizing the purity and devotion of Enoch's heart, took him directly into heaven, bypassing the grave entirely. His story is a testament to the transformative power of faith, showing us what it truly means to walk closely with God and live a life that aligns with divine purpose. If you are inspired by Enoch's incredible journey and want to explore more stories that uplift, challenge, and guide, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell. Join us as we uncover lessons from history that can shape your life today. Enoch's story is not just ancient history, it is an invitation to a life of faith, hope, and extraordinary purpose. Enoch's life cannot be understood without first appreciating the remarkable lineage from which he came, a lineage that carried the weight of faith through centuries of human history and moral turbulence. Born as the seventh generation from Adam, he descended from Seth, the son chosen by God to continue a line devoted to calling upon his name in a world increasingly swallowed by corruption, violence, and moral decay. This line of descendants was not merely a family tree marked by names and dates, but a living testimony of God's faithfulness, a beacon of hope and continuity amid a world where chaos and human ambition seemed to dominate every corner of the earth. Each generation, from Adam through Seth, Enoch, and onward, lived long lives, spanning hundreds of years, and with each passing generation, they carried forward stories, teachings, and a deep reverence for the divine that shaped not only their immediate families, but also the communities around them. These patriarchs were not perfect, but they were seekers, men who understood that life in communion with God required intentionality, persistence, and courage. In a time when societal structures were crumbling under the weight of greed and violence, the descendants of Seth maintained a thread of righteousness, cultivating practices of worship, prayer, and moral instruction that anchored them to the Creator. They were witnesses to the unfolding of human history in its rawest form, observing the rise and fall of cities, the expansion of knowledge, and the insidious spread of corruption that so often blinds humanity to its higher purpose. Enoch's childhood was steeped in this rich tradition of devotion. From an early age, he was immersed in the teachings of his forefathers, learning not only practical skills like farming and craftsmanship, but also the profound spiritual truths that had been passed down through generations. His grandfather, great-grandfather, and father shared with him the stories of Adam and Eve, of the garden, the fall, and God's promise of redemption. These narratives were more than historical accounts. They were living lessons designed to shape his understanding of right and wrong, to help him recognize the fleeting nature of worldly pursuits, and to instill in him the importance of seeking God above all else. Unlike those around him who were consumed by ambition, power, and selfish gain, Enoch was taught to perceive the eternal within the temporal, to discern the unseen hand of the Creator guiding history even when human actions seemed to veer wildly off course. The values imparted to him emphasized a life aligned with purpose and virtue, a life that would eventually position him to do what no other human before him had achieved, to walk with God in intimate fellowship, and to be taken into heaven without experiencing death. The world around Enoch could not have been more different from the path his family upheld. Cities buzzed with activity and innovation, yet they were filled with pride, selfishness, and moral blindness. People sought to dominate one another, relying on strength and cunning rather than justice and righteousness. And many had turned their backs on the God who had created them. Amid this cultural decay, Enoch's upbringing and spiritual heritage created a striking contrast, one that both illuminated the possibilities of faithful living and underscored the consequences of turning away from God. He saw firsthand how human ambition, untempered by moral responsibility, led to suffering and disorder, and he learned that true strength and lasting influence do not come from power or material success, but from a steadfast heart and an unwavering commitment to righteousness. As he grew, Enoch internalized the lessons of his lineage, understanding that walking with God was not a task for the faint-hearted, nor was it simply about adhering to inherited customs. It was about cultivating a personal relationship, a dynamic and living connection that required discernment, discipline, and a willingness to surrender one's own desires in pursuit of the divine will. This lineage of faith, stretching back through Seth and his forefathers, provided both the foundation and the model for Enoch's spiritual journey. Each story told, each prayer recited, and each act of worship practiced by his ancestors was a stepping stone, preparing him to rise above the pervasive corruption around him and to become a man whose life would ultimately testify to God's power, wisdom, and love in a way that no ordinary human life could. Enoch's connection to Seth's line also underscores the continuity of divine purpose across generations. While the world descended further into chaos and moral confusion, this sacred line remained a living thread of God's presence on earth, demonstrating that faith can endure, adapt, and influence even when surrounded by darkness. In this context, Enoch's story becomes more than an individual tale. It is the culmination of centuries of devotion, patience, and perseverance, showing how one life, nurtured in the right spiritual environment, can embody the ideals, hopes, and promises of an entire lineage. It was through this inheritance of faith, this careful cultivation of a godly heritage, that Enoch was equipped to not only withstand the corrupt world around him, but to walk in a unique intimacy with God, to perceive divine truth, and to serve as a prophetic voice warning of judgment and guiding humanity toward righteousness. Thus, Enoch's descent from Seth is not merely a genealogical note. It is the anchor of his identity, the source of his spiritual formation, and the reason he could achieve what no one else had. It situates him within a continuum of faith that spans generations, a line of people who sought God in the midst of moral decline, and it highlights the profound truth that our spiritual heritage, when embraced and lived out, has the power to shape destinies, influence communities, and inspire generations far beyond our own. In understanding Enoch's roots, we gain insight into how a life steeped in devotion, modeled by ancestors committed to God, can transform the ordinary into the extraordinary, turning one man's walk with God into a legacy that echoes through eternity. The story of Enoch cannot be fully understood without recognizing the extraordinary legacy of his ancestors. Men whose lives spanned centuries, and whose devotion to God created the spiritual foundation upon which he would build his own remarkable journey. Adam, Seth, and Jared, among others, were more than mere names in a genealogy. They were living repositories of divine wisdom, witnesses to the unfolding drama of human history, and keepers of a sacred trust that had been entrusted to them by the Creator. From the very beginning, Adam walked in communion with God, experiencing the wonder of creation firsthand and learning the profound responsibilities of stewardship over the earth and its inhabitants. Though human frailty and disobedience introduced tragedy and brokenness into the world, Adam's life marked the origin of a covenantal line, a lineage that would carry forward the knowledge of God, the importance of obedience, and the promise of redemption across the ages. Seth, Adam's appointed son, emerged as a figure of hope after the tragic loss of Abel, the firstborn who had been slain by his brother's jealousy. Seth represented continuity, a renewal of the divine promise, and the establishment of a lineage devoted to calling upon God. Through Seth, the faith that had once been nearly lost in the aftermath of human violence was preserved and nurtured, becoming a living testimony that righteousness and devotion could endure despite the chaos and moral decline around them. It was through Seth that the principles of worship, reverence, and remembrance of God's promises were passed to successive generations, ensuring that the knowledge of God did not fade with the mortality of any single life. Each patriarch who followed carried the responsibility of not only surviving, but actively cultivating a life of faith that could withstand the temptations and distractions of a world increasingly consumed by ambition, pride, and corruption. Enoch, Cainan, Mahalalel, and Jared each contributed to this tapestry of devotion in their own unique ways. Though they lived in an era marked by technological innovation and the expansion of human society, they understood that progress alone did not secure the soul or guarantee alignment with divine purpose. Their extraordinary lifespans allowed them to serve as living bridges across generations, conveying wisdom, reinforcing moral principles, and offering guidance that transcended the immediate concerns of their contemporaries. The lessons they imparted were not fleeting or superficial. They were embedded deeply in the rhythm of daily life, forming patterns of thought, behavior, and worship that would shape the spiritual character of their descendants. Jared, for example, witnessed centuries of human development, observing both the marvels of civilization and the creeping influence of moral decay, and he used his insight to nurture a son, Enoch, whose destiny would surpass that of any predecessor. The extended lifespans of these ancestors were not mere curiosities of history. They were instruments through which God's purposes were advanced. They allowed for continuous mentorship, the repeated telling of sacred stories, and the patient cultivation of character over decades, even centuries. These men experienced the full sweep of human society, from its moments of beauty and achievement to its failures and moral lapses, and through it all, they remained committed to a way of life that honored God. By doing, they established patterns of faith, worship, and moral responsibility that were tangible and observable, demonstrating that devotion was not theoretical but practical, enacted through daily choices, community engagement, and steadfast adherence to divine instruction. It was within this context that Enoch grew, absorbing the cumulative wisdom of centuries, witnessing the contrast between the godly line of his forebears and the surrounding world, descent into corruption and violence. The teachings of Adam, Seth, and Jared became a living curriculum for him, instilling in Enoch an understanding of human frailty, the necessity of obedience, and the possibility of divine intimacy. Unlike those whose vision was limited to their own lifespans, Enoch inherited a panoramic view of history, a sense of continuity that gave depth to his understanding of right and wrong, and a framework for walking in alignment with God's will. The example set by his ancestors showed him that a life of faithfulness could influence not only his own generation, but also those that followed, and that personal devotion, sustained over time, had the power to alter the course of history. Moreover, the names and lives of these patriarchs carried profound significance, each one a reflection of God's purposes and the virtues to which humanity was called. Adam, representing mankind and shared humanity; Seth, a sign of divine appointment and mercy; and Jared, whose life bridged centuries, all embodied principles that Enoch would later internalize and exemplify. Their collective legacy provided him with both the inspiration and the practical guidance necessary to cultivate an extraordinary relationship with God, one that transcended ordinary human experience. Through this lineage, Enoch came to understand that faith was not merely a private or personal matter, but a calling to participate in a story that spanned generations, a narrative in which the decisions of one life could resonate far beyond its temporal bounds. The devotion of Adam, Seth, and Jared created a fertile spiritual environment, allowing Enoch to grow into a man whose intimacy with God would set him apart, whose life would testify to the enduring power of faith, and whose example would illuminate the path of righteousness for generations yet to come. In embracing the inheritance of his ancestors, Enoch was able to walk in a manner that honored their legacy, fulfilled divine purpose, and ultimately achieved what no other human had done before him: to be taken into heaven without experiencing death, leaving behind a story that continues to inspire faith and devotion to this day. Names in Enoch's lineage were never mere labels. They were living declarations, carrying with them the weight of meaning, purpose, and spiritual identity that shaped the destiny of each individual and, by extension, the generations that followed. From Adam, whose name embodies the essence of humanity itself, through Seth, Enoch, Cainan, Mahalalel, Jared, and ultimately to Enoch, each name was infused with significance, a testament to the divine intentions woven into the very fabric of their lives. Adam's name reminds humanity of its shared origin, a symbol of connection, responsibility, and the intrinsic potential for both failure and redemption. It sets the stage for a story in which the choices of each person reverberate across time, creating ripples that touch the lives of those yet to come. Seth, meaning appointed or granted, is a name that conveys God's mercy in the aftermath of Abel's death, signaling the continuation of a sacred line committed to seeking and honoring the Creator despite the moral decay surrounding them. Each time Seth's name was spoken, it invoked the notion of divine favor, hope, and the ongoing covenant between God and mankind, reminding his descendants that their lives were part of a greater narrative unfolding across centuries. Enoch, whose name signifies mortality or frailty, adds another layer to this tapestry, highlighting the human need for guidance, dependence on God, and acknowledgement of one's limitations in the face of divine authority. In Enoch, there is a lesson about humility, the recognition that power, knowledge, and longevity mean little without alignment with higher purpose and moral integrity. Kainan, whose name carries the meaning of possession or acquisition, reflects the gifts and blessings that flow from obedience, reverence, and attentiveness to God's will, showing that prosperity and favor are intertwined with faithfulness and the cultivation of virtue. Mahalal, meaning praise of God, captures the essence of worship as central to life, illustrating that the most enduring legacy is not measured by wealth or earthly achievement but by devotion, gratitude, and the elevation of the divine in daily living. Jared, whose name suggests descent or the act of coming down, bridges these ideals across generations, standing as a link between the lessons of his forebears and the extraordinary destiny that awaited Enoch, carrying forward both spiritual knowledge and the moral obligations inherited from his lineage. Within this framework, Enoch's own name is both a continuation and a culmination, meaning dedicated, initiated, or trained up, signaling a life set apart for intimacy with God and divine purpose. The significance of these names cannot be overstated. They functioned as constant reminders to each individual of the calling embedded in their identity, shaping their worldview, guiding their actions, and influencing their relationships with the world around them. The patriarchs lived in a society where moral decline, violence, and self-interest were increasingly normalized. Yet the repeated invocation of these meaningful names in family gatherings, prayers, and communal worship acted as anchors, keeping the spiritual and ethical compass aligned with divine instruction. They were not merely educational tools but instruments of spiritual formation, embedding in the hearts and minds of each generation an understanding that their lives mattered in the grand story of humanity, that their choices could honor God, and that their devotion could ripple outward, affecting countless others. As Enoch matured, the weight of these names and their meanings became a living guide for him, shaping the way he perceived the world, understood his role within it, and approached his extraordinary relationship with God. He internalized the lessons encoded in his ancestry. Humanity is fragile and dependent on divine guidance. Mercy and grace are foundational to a life of faith. Praise and worship are not optional but central to identity, and each generation bears the responsibility of preserving and transmitting knowledge, virtue, and reverence to the next. These lessons became embodied in his daily routines, in the rhythms of his prayer, in his dedication to righteous living, and in the way he engaged with both followers and skeptics. Every action Enoch took reflected the accumulated wisdom of centuries, and every encounter he had with others was infused with the depth understanding conveyed through these meaningful names. The power of names extended beyond personal identity to communal memory, reinforcing the continuity of faith across generations. Parents calling their children by these names were not merely using labels, but invoking a spiritual inheritance, reminding the young that they were part of a line chosen for devotion, responsibility, and moral discernment. Each time the names were spoken, they reinforced the values, the hope, and the dependence on God that defined the patriarchs' lives, instilling in Enoch a profound awareness of the sacred heritage he carried. This awareness informed his every choice, guiding him to cultivate the intimacy with God that would eventually distinguish him from all others, positioning him to become the man taken to heaven without tasting death. In essence, the significance of the patriarchs' names created a living spiritual roadmap for Enoch, linking him to the lessons, virtues, and purposes of generations past while preparing him to fulfill his own extraordinary destiny. Through these names, he understood that life is more than survival or achievement. It is about fidelity to higher principles, awareness of divine purpose, and the willingness to embrace a calling that transcends personal ambition. This heritage, encoded in meaning, hope, and dependence on God, allowed Enoch to navigate a world rife with corruption and to embody a life of unwavering devotion, ultimately becoming a beacon of faith whose story would inspire countless generations to walk in the presence of the divine and pursue lives of extraordinary purpose. Enoch's early years were shaped by an environment rich in both practical instruction and spiritual mentorship, a world in which the lessons of daily life were inseparably intertwined with the truths of faith that had been nurtured over generations. Born into a lineage devoted to calling upon God amid a corrupt and increasingly violent society, he was immersed from birth in teachings that would prepare him for an intimacy with the divine that few, if any, before him had experienced. His father, Jared, and grandfather, Mahalalel, understood that the survival of their line's spiritual integrity required more than mere storytelling. It demanded consistent practice, modeling, and deliberate cultivation of virtues that would enable a child to perceive the eternal, even while living within the temporal. Enoch absorbed these lessons quietly at first, learning to observe the rhythms of life, to notice the patterns of human behavior, and to discern the ways in which the world both reflected and obscured the principles of God's order. The family home was a microcosm of sacred education, where work and worship were inseparable. From a young age, Enoch learned practical skills essential for sustaining life: farming, tending to animals, crafting tools, and understanding the cycles of nature that dictated survival. Yet alongside these practical lessons were teachings of a far deeper significance. The ways in which obedience, mindfulness, and integrity could align human actions with divine purpose. His ancestors understood that living faithfully in a world of corruption was not simply a matter of personal morality, but an ongoing negotiation with reality itself. A deliberate effort to embody values that would influence not only one's own life, but also the lives of neighbors, communities, and future generations. Enoch's training was thus holistic. He was not only instructed in how to till the soil or forge implements, but also in how to cultivate patience, wisdom, and discernment, qualities that would later allow him to walk in direct fellowship with God. Enoch's spiritual education was equally rigorous and immersive. His family ensured that he understood the narratives of their lineage, the creation of humanity, the fall, the promise of redemption, and the righteous line preserved through Seth's descendants. Each story was relayed with the weight of lived experience, as these men had personally witnessed centuries of human triumph and failure, blessing and judgment, growth and corruption. Through their guidance, Enoch internalized not only historical accounts but also the principles underlying them: the significance of faithfulness, the importance of righteous action, the necessity of humility before God, and the awareness that every life is interwoven with the destiny of others. This foundation instilled in him a sense of responsibility that was both personal and communal. He understood that walking with God required the cultivation of character in alignment with divine will, an awareness that his life could impact the broader moral and spiritual landscape around him. Rituals of prayer and worship formed a constant rhythm in Enoch's upbringing, teaching him to recognize God's presence in the ordinary and extraordinary alike. Daily acts of devotion, recitation of sacred names, and reflection on the deeds of his ancestors cultivated in him a spiritual sensitivity that would later enable prolonged communion with the Creator. Prayer was not a mechanical or perfunctory exercise. It was a means of attuning the heart, mind, and soul to the divine, a practice that required discipline, attention, and earnestness. Meditation, contemplation, and reflection became integral parts of his life, shaping how he approached challenges, decisions, and interactions with others. Through these spiritual disciplines, Enoch learned to perceive God's guidance in everyday life, to recognize the subtle interplay of divine influence in human affairs, and to integrate spiritual insight with practical action. The practical and spiritual training Enoch received were not compartmentalized but deeply intertwined, reinforcing the principle that holiness and wisdom must manifest in both thought and deed. As he worked the land, built structures, and engaged with the community, he practiced patience, diligence, and care, qualities that mirrored the moral and ethical frameworks taught by his family. Observing the ways in which his ancestors interacted with others, he internalized lessons in justice, compassion, and the exercise of authority tempered by mercy, preparing him to navigate a world rife with greed, violence, and pride. Every lesson in labor was simultaneously a lesson in virtue, every instruction in craft or survival a reflection of broader spiritual truths, and every conversation a vehicle for transmitting centuries of accumulated wisdom and devotion. Through this holistic preparation, Enoch matured into a young man whose mind, heart, and hands were all shaped by a combination of inherited wisdom, disciplined practice, and spiritual instruction. The grounding provided by his ancestors allowed him to develop an extraordinary capacity for discernment, empathy, and alignment with God's will, qualities that would define his later life and ministry. He came to understand that the pursuit of skill and knowledge alone was insufficient. True excellence required integration of spiritual insight with practical action, an awareness that the material and the spiritual are inseparable when living in accordance with divine principles. By observing, participating in, and internalizing the teachings of his forebears, Enoch prepared himself for a level of intimacy with God that would distinguish him from all other humans before and after, equipping him to walk in continuous fellowship with the Creator, perceive divine truths directly, and influence his generation through both example and prophecy. Enoch's upbringing exemplifies the profound impact of an environment where faith, wisdom, and practical skill converge. His family's intentional cultivation of his abilities and understanding created a foundation upon which he could build a life extraordinary not only in longevity or accomplishment but in spiritual depth, prophetic insight, and aligned with divine purpose. This preparation was meticulous and sustained, embedding in Enoch the awareness that living rightly in a corrupt world requires constant attention to both action and thought. That intimacy with God is cultivated over time through discipline and devotion, and that the integration of practical skills with spiritual insight forms the pathway to a life capable of transcending ordinary human limitations. Through this unique inheritance, Enoch was readied for a calling that would ultimately see him taken from the world without experiencing death. His life a testament to the power of faith, the influence of ancestry, and the extraordinary possibilities of divine fellowship. As Enoch matured, the foundations laid by generations of devoted ancestors bore fruit in a life marked by an extraordinary intimacy with God that transcended the ordinary human experience, setting him apart in ways that were both visible and profoundly spiritual. A man whose entire being reflected the alignment of heart, mind, and soul with divine purpose. From early morning prayers to the quiet reflection at the close of each day, Enoch's life became a continuous conversation with the Creator, a rhythm of communion that shaped his thoughts, actions, and perception of the world around him. Unlike the majority of his contemporaries, who pursued personal gain, fleeting pleasures, or dominance in an increasingly violent and morally chaotic society, Enoch's priorities were set on a plane that few could comprehend, as he walked daily in the awareness of God's presence, letting it inform every decision and guide every interaction. His relationship with God was not a distant formality or a matter of ritual compliance but an active, living fellowship that molded his character and worldview, imbuing him with wisdom that surpassed human understanding and equipping him to discern truth and righteousness with uncanny clarity. In this life of devotion, Enoch developed the ability to perceive the subtleties of divine will, understanding the moral currents that influenced human behavior and the spiritual consequences that unfolded beyond the sight of ordinary men. A discernment that set him apart from even those who sincerely sought God in his time. He learned to see the world through the lens of eternity, weighing actions and choices not merely by immediate results, but by their alignment with enduring principles of justice, mercy, and faithfulness. As cities grew in complexity, technology advanced, and human ambition increasingly overshadowed reverence, Enoch's spiritual sensitivity allowed him to maintain a perspective that was anchored in timeless truths, a clarity of vision that drew others toward him even as it highlighted the stark contrast between his life and the pervasive corruption surrounding him. The people who encountered him could not ignore the difference in his demeanor, his speech, and the depth of insight he exhibited, as it emanated naturally from a life harmonized with God's will. A testimony that drew both admiration and resentment, depending on the hearts of those who observed him. This intimate relationship with God manifested in more than wisdom and discernment. It shaped Enoch's moral courage and consistency, enabling him to live in a world that increasingly defied ethical and spiritual norms without succumbing to despair, cynicism, or compromise. He engaged with his community with a blend of compassion and authority, his guidance informed by direct communion with the divine, his admonitions and encouragements carrying a weight that ordinary experience could not replicate. Even when faced with skepticism or outright hostility, Enoch's responses reflected patience, understanding, and steadfast adherence to the principles he had internalized through decades of walking with God, demonstrating a life in which spiritual conviction and practical action were inseparable. Through every interaction, he exemplified the potential for human life to operate in harmony with divine purpose, serving as both a beacon and a mirror, a beacon to inspire those willing to seek righteousness, and a mirror reflecting the spiritual void of those who rejected the call to walk in faithful alignment. Enoch's fellowship with God was dynamic, involving not only prayer and meditation but also active listening and responsiveness to divine guidance. A relationship that was formative, transformative, and deeply interactive. The guidance he received shaped his personal conduct, informed his prophetic messages, and provided him with insights into the moral and spiritual trajectory of his society. Insights that would later be transmitted through his teachings, writings, and the example of his life. This level of communion required vigilance, devotion, and intentionality, as he navigated a world whose norms were increasingly hostile to the values he embodied. His alignment with God's purposes did not render him isolated or disconnected from human concerns. Rather, it allowed him to engage with the challenges of his time with a clarity and efficacy unavailable to those unacquainted with such profound spiritual intimacy. The depth of Enoch's connection with God also enabled him to perceive coming judgments and the overarching plan for humanity, insights that informed both his personal life and his ministry. He understood not only what was required of him in the present, but also how his faithfulness could influence generations to come, a responsibility that imbued his choices with significance beyond the immediate, beyond the visible, and beyond the temporal. His daily acts of devotion, prayer, and righteous living became a living chronicle of divine fellowship, a model for how human life can intersect with eternity when one's heart is fully dedicated to walking with God. This intimacy distinguished Enoch in every aspect of existence, from his family life to his public interactions, from his private reflections to his prophetic ministry. It cultivated patience, insight, and discernment that enabled him to confront the moral decline around him without succumbing to bitterness or despair. It equipped him to speak truth with authority, to encourage righteousness, and to warn of coming judgment with a clarity that could only stem from a heart entirely in harmony with God's will. Enoch's life was thus both extraordinary and instructive, providing a living example of what it means to dwell in perpetual fellowship with the Creator, a standard of faith that illuminated the possibilities of human potential when fully aligned with divine purpose. Ultimately, Enoch's deep, intimate relationship with God set him apart not as a figure of privilege or favoritism, but as the embodiment of a life fully dedicated to understanding, experiencing, and participating in divine truth. This extraordinary alignment with the Creator allowed him to transcend ordinary mortality, culminating in his translation from earth without experiencing death, a testament to the transformative power of genuine communion with God and a model for every generation that seeks to walk in the fullness of spiritual purpose, embracing both devotion and responsibility, insight and action, in a life wholly consecrated to the divine. As Enoch's life deepened in its extraordinary fellowship with God, he began to perceive not only the moral and spiritual realities of his own era, but also the unfolding trajectory of human history and the impending judgments that would shape the course of generations to come. Insights that set him apart as both a guide and a prophet in a world increasingly distant from its Creator. The violence, corruption, and pride that permeated the earth were not merely social phenomena to be observed from a distance. Enoch understood them as reflections of hearts that had turned from divine principles, and he felt compelled to intervene, not through force or coercion, but through the compelling witness of a life aligned with righteousness and the prophetic communication of truths revealed to him through intimate communion with God. Each day he walked in awareness of divine standards, perceiving the consequences of choices before they ripened into catastrophe. And with this understanding came a profound responsibility to call humanity back to a path of moral integrity, to remind them of the eternal implications of their actions, and to prepare them for the judgments that were certain to follow if they continued in willful ignorance and rebellion. One of the most tangible expressions of Enoch's prophetic calling was found in the naming of his son, Methuselah, an act that carried both personal significance and public proclamation. Unlike names given lightly or out of custom, Methuselah's name was deliberately chosen as a prophetic declaration, meaning, when he dies, it shall come, a foretelling of the flood that would sweep the earth as a consequence of widespread corruption and violence. This act of naming was not merely symbolic, but a living testimony interwoven with the rhythms of family and community life, ensuring that every mention of the child's name would serve as a reminder of divine justice and the necessity of righteousness. Through this singular act, Enoch communicated an unambiguous message that the Creator observes human behavior, that choices have consequences beyond immediate perception, and that faithful adherence to divine guidance is not optional but essential for survival and spiritual well-being. The naming of Methuselah encapsulated a broader prophetic responsibility, linking personal family life to cosmic moral truths, demonstrating that Enoch's devotion to God extended into every sphere of his existence, from private reflection to public instruction. Enoch's warnings of coming judgment were not abstract lectures, but urgent exhortations informed by direct revelation and an intimate understanding of divine justice. He spoke with authority because he had walked closely with God, having internalized principles that others barely recognized or ignored altogether. His words carried weight, resonating with those willing to listen and challenging the complacency of those who preferred comfort over conscience. He called people to righteousness not through condemnation alone, but through the example of his own life, showing that alignment with divine will brought clarity, peace, and purpose, even amid a world marked by chaos and moral decay. The people he addressed could not easily dismiss his counsel, for it was inseparable from the life he led, a life characterized by visible integrity, deliberate obedience, and unwavering faith in the promises he had learned to trust through the generations of instruction he had received from his ancestors. As he delivered his messages, Enoch's prophetic insight extended to both immediate and distant implications, revealing patterns of cause and effect that spanned decades and centuries. He understood that human behavior was cumulative, that the choices of one generation influenced the spiritual and moral health of those to follow, and that failure to heed divine warnings would have consequences reaching far beyond the individuals who first encountered them. This awareness imparted a sense of urgency and gravity to his ministry, compelling him to speak truth regardless of reception or personal risk. The ridicule and rejection he faced from many of his contemporaries did not diminish his resolve. Rather, it reinforced the importance of faithfulness over popularity, of obedience over approval, and of steadfastness in the face of widespread moral blindness. In this way, Enoch exemplified the courage required to act as a conduit for divine communication, demonstrating that prophecy is not simply the foretelling of events, but the active engagement in guiding humanity toward a higher standard of righteousness. The prophetic dimension of Enoch's life was inseparable from his role as a father, as the birth and naming of Methuselah provided both a personal and public dimension to his ministry. The name itself became a narrative device, a living emblem of warning and hope, signaling both judgment and the enduring possibility of divine mercy for those who heeded it. Through Methuselah, Enoch's prophetic influence extended into his family, creating a microcosm of spiritual vigilance that mirrored the broader moral landscape he sought to influence. Every interaction, every story shared, and every teaching reinforced the central truth of his calling, that human life carries eternal significance, that obedience to God is inseparable from moral insight, and that prophetic vision requires both discernment and action grounded in intimate knowledge of the Creator. Enoch's life, therefore, embodies a dual dynamic of personal and communal significance. He walked with God in a manner that transformed his character, informed his ministry, and equipped him to deliver warnings of coming judgment with clarity and authority, while simultaneously embedding prophetic truth into the very fabric of his family life. His alignment with divine will allowed him to perceive patterns that others could not, to act as both messenger and exemplar, and to cultivate an enduring legacy through Methuselah, whose very name spoke to the inevitability of judgment and the importance of righteousness. Through these intertwined dimensions, intimate fellowship, prophetic warning, and generational instruction, Enoch established a model of living faith, demonstrating that devotion to God is both profoundly personal and expansively influential, capable of shaping the course of history, while illuminating the path for those willing to walk in accordance with divine purpose. By calling people to righteousness, naming his son prophetically, and warning of coming judgment, Enoch transcended the ordinary limitations of human life, embodying the integration of spiritual insight, moral courage, and practical action, a life that not only foreshadowed future events but also illuminated a path of faithfulness, discipline, and alignment with divine principles that remains instructive and inspiring for every generation that seeks to understand what it truly means to walk with God. Enoch's life unfolded against the backdrop of a world descending into moral decay, a civilization where ambition, violence, and self-interest had begun to dominate the hearts of men, and where the light of divine instruction seemed increasingly dimmed by human arrogance and pride. Cities thrived with technological advancements and bustling activity, yet beneath the surface of progress lay corruption so pervasive that honesty, justice, and mercy had become rare commodities, traded for power, wealth, and fleeting pleasures. In this context, Enoch's devotion to God stood out like a single, unwavering flame in the midst of a storm, a light that not only illuminated his own path, but also revealed the stark contrast between the fleeting pursuits of a world consumed by wickedness and the enduring, stabilizing presence of righteousness. His upbringing, shaped by the teachings of his ancestors' stories of Adam's creation, Seth's legacy, and Jared's faithful witness had instilled in him a profound understanding of God's standards and a commitment to living in alignment with divine principles. Yet the society around him increasingly resisted these values, favoring self-determination over spiritual obedience and convenience over conscience. Despite the overwhelming prevalence of moral decline, Enoch navigated this world with a clarity of purpose that distinguished him from his peers. A perspective anchored not in fear of human reprisal, but in a deep understanding of divine justice and mercy. He observed the prideful accumulation of wealth, the exercise of might over right, and the neglect of the vulnerable, recognizing that these were not isolated transgressions but indicators of a systemic departure from the Creator's intended order. Yet Enoch's response was neither despair nor withdrawal. Rather, it was active engagement through both example and proclamation. His daily life demonstrated the feasibility of living faithfully amid corruption, revealing that devotion to God did not require disengagement from society but instead demanded a disciplined, courageous presence that could influence, instruct, and inspire even in the face of widespread opposition. Every action, every interaction, and every word became a channel through which he expressed his alignment with God's will, creating a living contrast between the temporal, morally bankrupt patterns of his culture and the enduring, stabilizing truth of a life devoted to the divine. In the midst of this morally decayed environment, Enoch's prophetic calling emerged naturally from his consistent fellowship with God, a calling that enabled him to perceive both the immediate consequences of human choices and the long-term trajectory of sin and virtue. His warnings of impending judgment were not abstract or theoretical. They were deeply grounded in observation and understanding of the human heart, informed by the intimate insights he received from God. Enoch's exhortations to righteousness were therefore compelling, carried not merely by the authority of human insight, but by the authority of one who had walked in direct communion with the Creator, whose life exemplified the principles he proclaimed, and whose presence served as both a mirror and a guide to a society that had largely forgotten what it meant to live in harmony with divine truth. Even as the corruption around him intensified, he remained steadfast, illustrating that moral decay need not dictate individual conduct, and that faithful living could be sustained even amid overwhelming societal opposition. The contrast between Enoch's godly devotion and the surrounding wickedness became a central theme of his ministry, demonstrating to contemporaries the tangible outcomes of alignment with divine will versus surrender to moral compromise. In public spaces, he could be seen engaging in acts of integrity, fairness, and compassion, behaviors that shone brightly against a backdrop of deceit, greed, and violence. In private, he cultivated a rhythm of prayer, meditation, and study, immersing himself in the wisdom passed down from his forefathers while remaining receptive to the direct guidance of God. This combination of private cultivation and public demonstration created a life that was at once inspiring and provocative, challenging the complacency of those who had grown accustomed to the normalized wickedness of their society, while offering a living example of the transformative power of intimate fellowship with the divine. Enoch's awareness of societal corruption did not lead him to condemnation without empathy. Rather, it deepened his sense of responsibility and urgency. He understood that individuals trapped in cycles of violence, pride, and greed were often blinded to the consequences of their actions, and that the stark contrast of a life devoted to God could serve as both a warning and an invitation. His interactions were deliberate, infused with insight and compassion, aiming to awaken in others an awareness of spiritual realities and the need for moral realignment. He embodied a life where faith was not passive but actively engaged, a model demonstrating that devotion to God requires discernment, courage, and the willingness to stand apart while still participating meaningfully in the human community. Amid this environment, Enoch's personal practices, his early rising for prayer, his consistent reflection on divine truths, and his disciplined cultivation of righteousness served as a counter-narrative to the prevailing moral decay. They demonstrated that virtue and fidelity to God were achievable even in a world dominated by vice, and that such fidelity had ripple effects, influencing those willing to observe, listen, and learn. Enoch's life became a living parable, a story of hope in a landscape dominated by despair, of light in the midst of pervasive darkness, of enduring faith in a world tempted by fleeting pleasures and power. His commitment illuminated the possibility of a life where human actions could align with divine purpose, and where the moral fabric of one individual could serve as a beacon to others. Ultimately, Enoch's existence within a morally decayed world highlights the extraordinary nature of his devotion, illustrating how one life, fully aligned with God, can both reflect and resist the corruption surrounding it, offering a model of integrity, courage, and prophetic insight that resonates across generations. His story teaches that faithfulness does not require isolation from the world but demands a steadfast commitment to righteousness, a courage to stand apart without arrogance, and a dedication to living in continuous communion with God, proving that even amid widespread wickedness, the path of devotion remains radiant, transformative, and enduring. Enoch's extraordinary journey reached its climactic testament when the Creator himself chose to take him from the earth, bypassing the natural course of life and death, an event that reverberates through Scripture as a profound illustration of the reward that awaits those who cultivate faithful and intimate communion with God. This divine translation was not merely an escape from mortality, but a culmination of a life characterized by unwavering dedication, persistent righteousness, and a heart wholly attuned to the will of the Almighty. A life that had been meticulously nurtured through generations of instruction, reflection, and practice in alignment with God's principles. From the earliest days, Enoch had been immersed in a culture of devotion, learning the sacred stories of his ancestors and the lessons of morality, worship, and spiritual insight that had been preserved and passed down by Adam, Seth, Jared, and Mahalalel, each generation adding depth and perspective to the narrative of faithful living. And Enoch had absorbed these truths with an intensity and clarity that set him apart from his contemporaries, making him a living embodiment of divine wisdom in a world increasingly blinded by its own pride and corruption. The moment of his translation was remarkable not for dramatic displays of fire or celestial fanfare, as some might imagine, but for its simplicity and the profound implication of God's pleasure in a life fully surrendered to Him. Scripture's brief account, stating merely that God took him, belies the magnitude of the event, for it signifies a unique intimacy and alignment between human and divine, a fellowship so complete that the barriers between the temporal and the eternal were temporarily dissolved, allowing Enoch to step directly into the presence of God without tasting the decay and finality of death. This act was emblematic of the ultimate reward for those who consistently walk in harmony with divine purpose, illustrating that faithfulness is not only measured by adherence to moral codes or ritualistic practice, but by the depth of relational communion cultivated with the Creator, a communion that transforms character, informs judgment, inspires prophetic clarity. The very act of being taken by God validated all that Enoch had lived and taught, offering a tangible demonstration that a life devoted to righteousness and intimate fellowship is recognized, honored, and ultimately exalted beyond the limitations of mortal existence. Enoch's translation also serves as a narrative lens through which we can understand the enduring principles of divine reward, showing that extraordinary outcomes in human life are not the result of mere chance or superficial piety but of sustained, intentional alignment with God's purposes. Over the course of his life, Enoch had walked daily in awareness of divine standards, integrating his faith into every aspect of his existence through prayer. Meditation. Family instruction. Ethical conduct and prophetic proclamation, and this holistic approach to spiritual living became the foundation for the extraordinary favor he received. His warnings to his contemporaries about impending judgment, his prophetic naming of Methuselah, and his consistent personal example of virtue all reinforced the reality that intimate fellowship with God is both transformative and consequential. Producing discernment, authority, and a capacity to influence the moral and spiritual trajectory of others in ways that extend far beyond immediate perception. Moreover, the brevity and matter-of-fact nature of Enoch's departure invite reflection on the relational quality of the divine reward. It is not always spectacular in human terms, yet it is supremely significant in spiritual terms. God's choice to take Enoch directly to heaven underscores a profound principle that divine favor is relational rather than transactional, rooted in character, obedience, and the cultivation of trust and intimacy over time. Enoch's life demonstrates that those who earnestly seek God, who integrate spiritual wisdom into daily living, and who prioritize communion over convenience can experience a level of divine closeness that transcends ordinary human experience, offering a glimpse of eternity while still engaged in temporal existence. His translation is therefore both a reward and a testament, affirming the reality of God's presence, the viability of righteous living amid pervasive corruption, and the transformative power of persistent, sincere faithfulness. This narrative also highlights the interconnectedness of Enoch's personal devotion and his wider prophetic mission. His translation was not an isolated benefit. It carried implications for those around him, serving as a living validation of his ministry and a demonstration of God's justice, mercy, and ability to honor those who faithfully represent him. The righteous remnant who witnessed or learned of Enoch's departure would have understood it as a confirmation of the truths he proclaimed, a tangible proof that alignment with God yields not only moral clarity but divine recognition and eternal reward. It became a story to inspire future generations, a legacy interwoven with his forefathers' teachings, the prophetic messages he delivered, and the enduring hope that intimate fellowship with God is both possible and supremely rewarding. In observing Enoch's translation, one perceives a life meticulously oriented toward divine purposes, a life in which faithfulness, obedience, and relational depth intersect to produce outcomes that transcend human expectation. It exemplifies the principle that spiritual intimacy is not incidental but intentional, cultivated through decades of disciplined engagement with God's Word, prayer, and righteous action. Enoch's experience teaches that divine reward is not merely about avoidance of suffering or achievement of personal ambition, but about the cultivation of a heart that consistently seeks God, the development of a character that mirrors divine principles, and the alignment of one's life with eternal truths in ways that ripple outward, affecting family, community, and even the course of history. Ultimately, Enoch's translation serves as a profound reminder that the reward for intimate, faithful communion with God surpasses ordinary comprehension, offering both eternal significance and lasting inspiration. His story illustrates that devotion anchored in relationship, integrity, and sustained spiritual discipline is recognized by the Creator, celebrated through divine action, and preserved as a guiding example for all who seek to walk faithfully with God, demonstrating that a life devoted to spiritual alignment and moral courage is capable of transcending even the most fundamental boundaries of human existence. As we come to the close of Enoch's extraordinary story, it becomes clear that his life was far more than a single, remarkable example of faith. It was a living testimony that continues to echo across generations, inspiring hope, courage, and devotion in all who hear of it. The simple yet profound account of a man walking so closely with God that he bypassed death offers a vision of what is possible when one's life is fully aligned with divine purpose, a life where persistent obedience, intimate fellowship, and unwavering faith produce outcomes that transcend the ordinary and touch the eternal. Enoch's example was not merely personal, it was generational. From the moment he was born into a lineage devoted to God, through the centuries of learning, mentoring, and witnessing the world's moral decay, his life reflected a continuity of purpose that underscored the power of spiritual inheritance, the passing down of wisdom, virtue, and divine truth from one generation to the next. The stories of Enoch did not end with his translation. They became seeds planted in the hearts of those who would follow, demonstrating that faithfulness to God has far-reaching consequences beyond what is immediately visible. Parents could tell their children of the man who lived righteously in a corrupt world, teaching them that even amid wickedness, integrity, compassion, and devotion to God could shine brightly and influence others. Communities that embraced his example learned that one life, fully surrendered to divine guidance, could stand as both a warning and a beacon, revealing the difference between fleeting worldly pleasures and enduring spiritual truths. His prophetic insight, the naming of his son Methuselah, and his constant warnings about impending judgment provided more than historical context. They offered a framework for understanding God's plan for humanity and the ultimate outcomes of faith versus folly. Every tale of his walks with God, every account of his prayers and teachings, became a template for righteous living, a guide for future generations seeking to navigate a world often dominated by moral compromise. Furthermore, Enoch's life foreshadowed events of ultimate spiritual significance, offering a glimpse of divine patterns that would unfold throughout history. The biblical connection to the rapture, described in passages such as 1 Thessalonians 4:17, resonates deeply with Enoch's extraordinary departure, illustrating that faithful communion with God is not bound by the limitations of human life or death, and that there is a promise of hope for those who persist in their devotion. This story reminds us that God's plans extend beyond the immediate, that actions rooted in faith ripple through time, and that the faithful can anticipate both reward and vindication in ways that defy ordinary expectation. Enoch's translation serves as a living symbol of the possibility of transcending mortality through complete alignment with divine will, showing that hope is not merely theoretical but attainable for those who pursue righteousness earnestly, cultivate spiritual intimacy, and embrace the responsibilities of faith. As we reflect on his story, it is also an invitation to examine our own lives and consider the ways we might walk with God more intentionally, integrating our beliefs into every action, thought, and relationship. Enoch's example challenges us to live in a manner that is both faithful and transformative, encouraging us to rise above the moral compromises and distractions that pervade our culture, and to cultivate a spiritual discipline that is both persistent and personal. The legacy of his life calls us to a higher standard, reminding us that true devotion is measured not by fleeting achievements or external recognition but by the depth of intimacy with God, the integrity of our choices, and the enduring influence of our example on those who come after us. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this incredible story of Enoch, the man who walked with God and was taken to heaven without experiencing death, a life that continues to inspire hope, faith, and devotion to this day. If you found this story inspiring, transformative, or thought-provoking, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications so you never miss content that can deepen your spiritual journey and understanding of God's extraordinary plan for humanity. Share this story with your friends, family, and loved ones, so together we can spread the timeless truths of faith, perseverance, and divine intimacy that have the power to change lives and generations to come. May the example of Enoch encourage each of us to pursue righteousness, cultivate intimate fellowship with God, and walk faithfully even in a world that often seems consumed by moral decay. Let his life serve as a beacon of hope, a reminder that faithfulness is rewarded, that God's presence is real, and that the promise of eternal communion is within reach for all who earnestly seek Him. And as we close for today, I wish you a peaceful night, restful sleep, and dreams filled with inspiration, courage, and renewed commitment to walk faithfully in your own journey of life. Good night.